It was early one Tuesday morning, just as the sun was beginning to peek over the horizon, when my phone rang. The call jolted me out of a deep sleep, and I groggily reached for it. I rubbed my eyes and glanced at the screen, seeing Mrs. Thompson's name flashing. I had never been a morning person, and certainly not at 6 a.m., but when I saw that Mrs. Thompson was calling, I knew it was something important. "Hello?" I answered, my voice still thick with sleep. "They're building houses on your property." Mrs. Thompson's voice was shaking, but not with fear. It was more with anger, the kind of anger that comes when someone's been wronged and wants the world to know it. "A big yellow machine started digging yesterday. You need to come quickly, Alex." I rubbed my forehead, trying to process her words. "Wait, what? They're building on my property?" I repeated, unsure if I had heard her right. "Yes," she said, clearly frustrated. "They've put up signs all over. They're planning to build almost 100 houses right where your east fields are. They've already started digging." It didn't make sense. I'd inherited Grandpa Joe's farm, a 200-acre plot of land outside of Meadow Creek. I'd always known this land, had grown up visiting it, playing in the fields as a child, helping Grandpa with the harvest during the summers. He'd never mentioned selling it, not even in his final days when his health was failing. If anything, Grandpa Joe had always been adamant that this land, this farm, would stay in the family for generations. Mrs. Thompson's voice cut through my thoughts. "You need to come quickly, Alex. Before it's all gone." I threw on clothes and grabbed a suitcase. I didn't waste a moment. I knew I had to get to Meadow Creek as fast as I could. Grandpa's old farm, his legacy, was at stake. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew something wasn't right. In a blur, I packed a bag and sped off, breaking every speed limit I could along the 5-hour drive to the farmhouse. The familiar road felt different now. The landscape I once knew, peaceful and untouched, was interrupted by the rumble of heavy machinery. Dust clouds rose above the trees, an ugly sign of something terrible happening. As I reached the crest of the hill that overlooked the eastern fields of Grandpa's land, my heart sank. Bulldozers, excavators, and trucks were everywhere, tearing into the soil where Grandpa used to grow corn and soybeans. Workers in hard hats moved around like ants, marking areas with bright orange spray paint. And there it was, a large sign near the road that read, "Future home of Sunny Pines East, 96 luxury homes starting at $450,000. I couldn't believe it. I parked my car and walked toward a woman standing apart from the workers. She was impeccably dressed in spotless beige pants and a crisp white blouse, her hair perfectly styled despite the dust around her. She looked out of place in the middle of a construction site. She was speaking on her phone as I approached, holding a clipboard in one hand. I waited until she finished her call, then stepped forward. "Excuse me," I said. "What's going on here?" She looked me up and down as if I were interrupting her morning tea. "We're preparing for residential development," she replied, her voice smooth and practiced. She extended her hand to shake mine, but there was no warmth in the gesture. "Diane Reynolds, Sunny Pines Homeowners Association president." "This is my land," I said, ignoring her outstretched hand. "My grandfather, Joe Miller, owned this farm. He passed away recently, and I inherited it." Diane's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. "There must be some misunderstanding," she said, trying to brush me off. "Sunny Pines purchased this parcel last year. We have all the necessary permits and approvals." "That's impossible," I replied, feeling a knot form in my stomach. "My grandfather would never have sold this land." Diane looked almost pitying. "Perhaps he didn't tell you. The sale was finalized 9 months ago. We've been planning this expansion for years." My mind was racing now. Grandpa had been sick during his final months, but he had always been sharp. He would never have sold the land without telling me. There had to be some mistake, some sort of fraudulent act. I need to see those documents, I demanded, my voice growing firm. Diane's expression shifted ever so slightly. She handed me a business card without saying anything more. "You're welcome to contact our legal department," she said with a dismissive tone. "But I assure you, everything is in order." I stood there, feeling a sense of helplessness wash over me. The machines kept tearing up the land that had been in my family for generations. The very soil where Grandpa had worked so hard, where he had taught me everything I knew about farming, was being destroyed before my eyes. I could almost hear his voice in my head, reminding me that this land wasn't just dirt, it was family. And now, someone was taking it from us. Back at the farmhouse, Mrs. Thompson was waiting on the porch with a glass of iced tea, looking even more worried than before. "They started showing up with measuring tools about 3 months ago," she told me as I sat down next to her. "Your grandpa was furious. He kept saying they had no right, that they were trying to steal what wasn't theirs." "Did he mention selling any land?" I asked, my voice tight with tension. "Never," she said, shaking her head. "Joe swore this farm would stay in your family forever." Her words were like a punch to the gut. Grandpa had fought for this land. He had protected it, and now it felt like it was slipping through my fingers. But why had he never told me about selling it? Mrs. Thompson's voice softened as she continued. "The day before he went to the hospital for the last time, he was going through his old office. He said he needed to find something important to protect the farm." I stared at her, trying to understand. What did he need to protect? Mrs. Thompson didn't know, but it sounded important, like he had known something was coming. Maybe he had known the development was coming, or maybe something more sinister. Either way, I had to find out. The only place left to search was Grandpa's office. That's where all the answers were, and I was determined to find them. Grandpa's office was small but cozy, filled with old books, farming journals, and photographs of the family. It smelled like pipe tobacco and old leather. Nothing had changed since his death, and I had avoided it for months, not ready to go through his things. But now, it seemed like the only place to get the answers I needed. I rummaged through the filing cabinets, sifting through papers. But there was nothing about land sales or Sunny Pines. Hours passed as I scoured every drawer, every box, every shelf. By the time the sun began to set, I was ready to give up. But then, something caught my eye, a loose floorboard under Grandpa's desk. With my heart racing, I kneeled down and pressed my foot against it. The board shifted. I carefully pried it open with a letter opener, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, there was a small metal box, and the key was hanging from a nail on the underside of the desk. I hesitated for a moment, then unlocked the box. Inside were several important documents, the deed to the farm, Grandpa's will, and a few old property surveys. But the most surprising item was a letter written in Grandpa's unmistakable handwriting, addressed to me. It began, "If you're reading this, then someone's trying to take what's ours." My hands shook as I read his words. Grandpa explained that developers had been eyeing his land for years, trying to pressure him into selling. In his final months, someone from Sunny Pines had visited repeatedly, claiming they needed his signature for a road easement. But Grandpa was adamant, he never signed away his land. "If they say I did, it's a lie," he wrote. "Look at the original survey from 1910 and compare it to what's recorded at the county now. The truth is in the boundaries." I pulled out the original survey from 1910 and compared it to the newer maps. My heart stopped when I saw what Grandpa had discovered. The property lines had shifted over the decades, and we owned land where Sunny Pines was already built, where they had been building new homes. This was it. The proof. The development on my land was illegal. I just had to find a way to stop them. The night was restless. My mind raced with thoughts of what I had just uncovered. Grandpa's letter had laid it all out, the property lines, the lies, and the fraud. But as my eyes scanned over the original surveys, my heart was heavy with the weight of what I now had to do. This wasn't just a matter of a few boundary lines. This was my family's legacy, my inheritance, and someone had taken it from us. Worse yet, they had done it without my knowledge, using deceptive methods and legal loopholes. The truth was in my hands, but I wasn't sure where to start. Grandpa's letter had given me a clear directive: find the truth in the records and fight to restore what was rightfully ours. But how? What could I possibly do against a development company as powerful as Sunny Pines, led by someone like Diane Reynolds? The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that I needed a lawyer, someone who could help me navigate the legal maze and ensure that my grandfather's wishes were honored. I didn't trust Sunny Pines' claims, and I certainly didn't trust Diane Reynolds, who had been so quick to dismiss me when I confronted her at the construction site. The next morning, I made my way to Walter Franklin's office, the only property lawyer in Meadow Creek. He was an older man, his thick glasses perched on the edge of his nose, and he wore a bow tie that seemed as though it came straight out of another era. As I explained my situation, he listened carefully, his expression turning serious as I handed him the documents Grandpa had left behind. According to these documents, Walter said, after carefully reviewing the original surveys and comparing them to the current county records, your property extends nearly half a mile further east than what's currently recorded. That would include not just the construction site, but also the existing Sunny Pines clubhouse and about 20 homes built 5 years ago. His words struck me like a thunderclap. It was even worse than I had imagined. The land they were building on wasn't just a small part of the farm. It was a substantial portion of it, a piece of history, of memories, that had been taken without my consent. This is highly unusual, Walter continued, after a long pause. These boundary markers don't match anything in the county's records. Someone must have deliberately altered them. I nodded grimly. I had suspected as much. Grandpa had been meticulous about keeping records, and everything he had documented pointed to an intentional manipulation of the property lines. But who would benefit from this fraud? And how had they managed to pull it off without anyone noticing? Walter leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. We need to understand how and when these changes occurred in the official record. The first step is to contact the county assessor's office. I agreed. I had to know when the land had been altered and why. Walter made the call, and after navigating through a maze of departments, we got some shocking news. In 1984, a minor adjustment to the eastern boundary was recorded, a mere 10-foot easement for utilities. But in 1997, a much larger change appeared. The property had been reduced by nearly 80 acres. The documentation was minimal, just a form with a signature that didn't resemble Grandpa's handwriting at all. He would have been in the hospital that month, I said, feeling a lump form in my throat. Triple bypass surgery. He couldn't have signed this. Walter's face grew grim. That would constitute fraud, Alex. But proving it after all these years won't be easy. I was determined, though. I couldn't let this stand. The fraud needed to be exposed, and the land had to be returned to its rightful owner, my family. But how? What could I do next? First, we file for an emergency injunction to halt construction immediately, Walter suggested. Then we petition the court to recognize the original boundaries based on the historic surveys. We'll need a professional surveyor to verify these old maps, but this is a strong case. I nodded, feeling a flicker of hope for the first time. Maybe we could stop this. Maybe we could fight back. But I also knew that there was more at play here than just a boundary dispute. This wasn't a simple case of land ownership. Diane Reynolds and the Sunny Pines HOA were powerful, and they had connections that ran deep in the local government. They had likely been orchestrating this for years, and they weren't going to give up easily. I needed to dig deeper. I drove to the county records office to request all documents related to the Sunny Pines development. As I pored through the stacks of public records, I stumbled upon something that made my stomach churn. Sunny Pines wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a complex web of LLCs and holding companies, with the same 6 names appearing over and over again: Diane Reynolds, her husband Thomas Reynolds, County Commissioner James Harris, Planning Board Director Mark Wilson, and 2 others I didn't recognize. But the most shocking discovery came when I found a loan approval document for $16 million, granted to Sunny Pines East just 3 months ago. The land, it seemed, was being used as collateral for the loan. My land. I took photos of everything. This was the ammunition I needed, and it was only the beginning. I still didn't know the full extent of what had happened, but I was determined to find out. My next stop was the Meadow Creek Gazette, where Tanya Williams, the editor, had known my grandfather for years. I had to be careful about what I shared, but I also knew that Tanya was the one person who might help me uncover the full scope of what was going on. I can't publish accusations without evidence, she warned me when I explained the situation. But I can look into the approval process for this development. It did seem to move unusually fast. I thanked her, knowing that this was another piece of the puzzle. There was something shady going on here, and I was going to get to the bottom of it. Back at the farmhouse, I found Mrs. Thompson speaking with Mr. Grayson, another elderly neighbor who had lived in the area for years. When he heard about the Sunny Pines development, his face darkened. "That woman, Diane Reynolds," he muttered bitterly. "She's the reason I sold my place. The HOA fined me every week for unapproved landscaping, for growing tomatoes, for a workshop violation they just made up. The fines kept coming until I couldn't afford to fight anymore. How many others have this happened to?" I asked, my frustration growing. "At least a dozen," Mr. Grayson replied. "All sold out. Always for less than market value, always to companies connected to the Sunny Pines people." The pattern was becoming clearer. They found vulnerable landowners, harassed them with fines and regulations, forced them to sell their properties for far less than they were worth, then developed the land and made millions. And Grandpa Joe had been their latest target. But Grandpa hadn't been easy prey. He had fought for this land, and he had left me the tools to fight too. It was time to take action. I spent the next few days gathering more evidence and preparing for the fight of my life. I needed to stop the development, expose the fraud, and protect my family's land. But Diane Reynolds was not going to back down easily. She had built an empire, and she wasn't about to let one grieving grandchild stand in her way. But what Diane didn't know was that Grandpa Joe had anticipated this fight. He had left me more than just land, he had left me the tools to fight back. And I wasn't about to let anyone take what was mine. The real fight had only just begun. I didn't sleep that night. My mind was racing, spinning with thoughts of how to fight this, of how to stop Diane Reynolds and her HOA from continuing their theft. Every document I had gathered, every discovery I made, painted a clear picture of deception, corruption, and greed. I had the evidence, but I needed to be strategic. Sunny Pines wasn't just a development project, it was a network of powerful people, connected by money and influence. The more I uncovered, the more I realized I wasn't just up against an HOA, I was up against a whole system. The next morning, I met with Walter Franklin, the lawyer who had been helping me since I uncovered the fraud. We had a lot of work to do, and the clock was ticking. If we didn't act quickly, Sunny Pines could finish its construction, and I'd lose any chance of recovering my family's land. "We need to act fast," Walter said as we sat in his office, the original land surveys spread across his desk. "The longer this goes on, the more difficult it will be to undo. The county is already complicit in the misrecording of property lines, and Diane Reynolds has connections everywhere. This won't be easy." I nodded, determined. "I don't care how hard it gets. We have to stop them." Walter's expression grew more serious. "The emergency injunction will buy us time, but it's only the first step. We also need to gather more evidence of fraud. A lot more." We spent hours poring over documents, preparing a case that would challenge the legality of the Sunny Pines development. Walter contacted a professional surveyor who could verify the original surveys, and we also arranged to have the county assessor's records reviewed by an independent expert. We couldn't leave any stone unturned. But even as we prepared our legal strategy, I couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. Diane Reynolds wasn't just a person. She was the face of something far more dangerous, an entire network of powerful people who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. And I had a feeling that if I wasn't careful, I would become their next target. By mid-afternoon, Walter had arranged for the emergency injunction to be filed. We needed to stop construction immediately. But as we were preparing to submit the documents, I received a call that made my stomach drop. Diane Reynolds just filed a counterclaim, Walter said, his voice tight with frustration. She's accusing you of fraud, claiming your documents are fake, and saying that you're trying to disrupt the development. They're asking for damages, and they're going to try to force you to drop your claims. It wasn't just about protecting my family's land anymore. It was about fighting for everyone who had been hurt by Sunny Pines. The more I talked to these people, the more I realized that I wasn't just up against Diane Reynolds, I was up against an entire system that had been taking advantage of the community for years. One of the first to reach out to me was Gerald Fisher, the HOA treasurer who had attended the meeting when I revealed the fraudulent land records. Gerald had been working with Sunny Pines for years, but he wasn't happy with what he had seen. When I reached out to him, he agreed to meet with me in private. "I've been keeping the HOA books for 7 years, Gerald said when we sat down in my living room. "And let me tell you, something's wrong. Diane and her people have been using HOA funds like their personal bank account. Special fees, contracts for services that go to family members. The reserve funds? They're vanishing." I looked at him, stunned. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I can't take it anymore," Gerald replied, shaking his head. "I've been trying to look into it, but every time I raise questions, Diane shuts me down. But when you showed up with those property documents, it was the first time I saw her scared. You're the first person in years who's been brave enough to stand up to her." I felt a sense of relief wash over me. Gerald wasn't the only one who had had enough. There were others, too. I began to meet with people from the community who had been hurt by Diane's rules and her control. I visited families who had been fined for trivial things, like not having the right color mailbox, or growing vegetables in their garden. These people were ready to fight back, and I realized that I had more allies than I initially thought. In the meantime, Walter and I continued to work on the legal side of things. We filed for the emergency injunction, which would temporarily halt the construction while the court reviewed the case. Diane's team fought back hard, filing motions to have the injunction lifted, but we kept pushing forward. But just as I thought we were making headway, things took a darker turn. One morning, I woke up to find that Sunny Pines security had blocked off the entrance to my property. Concrete barriers were placed across my driveway, and several security vehicles were parked nearby. I couldn't leave, couldn't even drive to town for food. It was clear that Diane was trying to intimidate me. I called the sheriff's office, but they told me they couldn't help with civil disputes. I was trapped on my own property, and it felt like the walls were closing in around me. Just as I was beginning to feel hopeless, my phone rang. It was Walter. "Good news," he said, his voice sounding more upbeat than it had in days. "The judge granted our emergency injunction. Construction has to stop immediately until the hearing next week." I felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't over yet. We had won a small victory, but the real fight was still ahead. Diane wasn't going to give up easily, and I had no illusions about how far she was willing to go to protect her development. But now, at least, we had the legal grounds to stop her. That afternoon, I drove to the construction site with the court order in hand. The workers were packing up for the day when I arrived, and Diane's sleek black SUV was still parked near the site office. I could feel her presence before I even saw her. She stepped out of the SUV, phone pressed to her ear, and then spotted me. Her expression hardened, and I could see the coldness in her eyes. "Construction stops now," I said firmly, holding up the court order. "The legal boundaries are in dispute." Diane glanced at the document, her face momentarily cracking, but she quickly recovered. "This is ridiculous," she sneered. "We have every approval we need." "Those approvals are based on fraudulent property lines," I said, my voice steady. "I have the original surveys. Your permits are based on lies." For a split second, uncertainty flashed in her eyes, but it was gone in a flash. "This little stunt is going to cost you," she hissed, her voice low and menacing. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." I stood my ground, unshaken. "Actually, I do. 6 names on dozens of business filings. $16 million in loans using stolen land as collateral. County officials fast-tracking approvals for projects they secretly invest in. You've been stealing from me and from the people of this town, Diane." Her perfectly manicured hand tightened around her phone until her knuckles turned white. "You're making a mistake," she hissed. "We can be reasonable. Maybe you'd consider a generous offer for the remaining farmland? 7 figures, immediate payment." "Not interested," I replied, turning to leave. "Everyone has a price, but not me." As I reached my car, I could hear her voice calling after me, a final attempt at intimidation. "Commissioner Harris is my husband's golf partner. Judge Evans comes to my dinner parties. You think your injunction will last? You're nobody in this town." I drove away, her words echoing in my mind. She was right about one thing, I was an outsider here now. But I had something Diane hadn't counted on, Grandpa Joe's legacy, and the truth. And the truth was about to change everything. Hashtag Part 4, the fight unfolds. The following days were a blur of legal documents, phone calls, and desperate planning. I had seen Diane Reynolds' power and influence firsthand, and I knew that she wouldn't go down without a fight. The court hearing was still a week away, and though the emergency injunction had stopped the construction, it was only temporary. Diane was already moving behind the scenes, using her connections to try and nullify the injunction and keep the development going. She had resources, influence, and a vast network of people in her corner, but I had something she didn't expect. A community ready to stand with me. Word had spread quickly through Meadow Creek about the dispute, and it wasn't long before people began reaching out to offer their support. Some had been the victims of Diane's HOA tactics, others simply didn't like what they were seeing unfold. It was clear that Sunny Pines wasn't just about a new development, it was about control. Diane and her allies were systematically squeezing everyone around them, forcing them to sell land, making their lives unbearable with fines, rules, and threats. The first person to reach out was Gerald Fisher, the HOA treasurer who had been with Sunny Pines for years. I knew he wasn't a fan of Diane, and he had been the first person to show concern when I exposed the fraudulent land surveys at the community meeting. Gerald wasn't just an ally in this fight, he had insider knowledge of how Diane and the HOA were operating, and that knowledge was priceless. One afternoon, he showed up at my farmhouse, looking over his shoulder nervously. "I shouldn't be here," he said quietly, glancing at the security vehicles still stationed outside. "But I can't stand by while Diane's running this town into the ground. I have documents, proof of what she's been doing with the HOA's funds." My heart raced. I invited him inside, away from the prying eyes of the security guards stationed around the property. Gerald opened his laptop and began showing me the financial records of the HOA. It was worse than I imagined. Over the years, Diane and her people had been siphoning money from the HOA's reserve funds. Special assessments were levied on homeowners for road repairs and other supposed improvements, but the actual work cost far less than what was charged. The difference? It disappeared into businesses owned by Diane and her family members. "This is criminal," I said, staring at the spreadsheets that Gerald had pulled up. "She's been using the HOA as a personal slush fund." Gerald nodded gravely. It's more than that. The books don't add up. Diane has been inflating costs, funneling money into companies that she controls. Some of the homes on your land, the ones already built, are in violation of regulations. She promised fixes for drainage problems, but she's never delivered. She's been covering up for her own financial benefit. I stared at the screen, a sinking feeling in my chest. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Because I can't let her get away with it, Gerald replied. I'm not the only one who's fed up. There are people in the community who've been pushed to their breaking point. We all want to stop this. Diane's been controlling everything, but now we have a chance to fight back. Gerald's words sparked something in me. This wasn't just about me and my grandfather's farm anymore. This was about everyone who had been mistreated by Diane and the Sunny Pines HOA. We were going to take her down, together. Later that day, I made a few more phone calls. Word had spread quickly through Meadow Creek, and the support I was receiving was overwhelming. The next evening, I held an emergency meeting at the farmhouse. I invited everyone who had been affected by the HOA's rules and tactics, the people who had been fined for trivial violations, the families who had been harassed for minor infractions, the elderly couples who had been threatened with liens and foreclosure. More than 20 people showed up, some in person, some via video calls. The room was filled with a sense of urgency, but also something else, hope. It was the first time these people felt like they had a chance to stand up for themselves. Everyone was sick of the power that Diane had over them, and now they were ready to fight back. Gerald stood at the front of the room, a stack of papers in his hands. I've been looking at the HOA's financial records for years, he said, his voice steady but filled with anger. And what I've found is enough to bring this whole house of cards down. Diane's been stealing from the community, lining her pockets with money that should have gone to the homeowners. It's not just about property lines anymore, it's about a corrupt system that's been going on for far too long. I stood up next, my heart pounding in my chest. Diane thought she could intimidate me into giving up. She thought she could just take my family's land and build her luxury homes. But I'm not backing down. This land is mine, and I'm going to fight for it. But I can't do it alone. The room was silent for a moment, and then one by one, people began to speak up. They shared their stories of harassment, of the fines they'd received for breaking Sunny Pines rules, of the pressure they'd been under to sell their homes or land to Diane and her associates. It became clear that this wasn't just about the land under construction, it was about the people who had been abused and manipulated by Diane's HOA for years. I don't have much left, one woman said, her voice shaky. They've fined me every week for the last year, for having an unapproved fence around my garden. My husband passed away last spring, and I don't have the money to fight them. But I'm with you. We have to stop this. I've had enough, another man said. They made my wife tear down our vegetable garden. I've lived here my whole life, and I'm not going to let them ruin it for everyone. The more I heard, the more determined I became. We had a real chance to take down Diane and her corrupt network. But we couldn't do it alone. We needed to make sure the community stood behind us, and we needed to get the word out. By the end of the meeting, we had a plan. Gerald would help us organize the community, and we would start gathering signatures for a petition to demand an independent audit of the HOA's finances. We would also need to work together to expose the illegal practices Diane and her associates had been engaged in. The more pressure we could apply, the better our chances of winning this fight. As the meeting ended and people trickled out, I felt a sense of resolve settle over me. The fight wasn't just for my grandfather's land anymore, it was for all the people who had been bullied and mistreated by Diane and her HOA. We weren't just going to take her down, we were going to expose the entire operation for what it was. And we were going to do it together. But I knew that Diane wouldn't go down without a fight. She had too much to lose. She had spent years building her empire, and she wasn't about to let a grieving grandchild and a small group of angry homeowners bring it all crashing down. But I had something she didn't expect, the truth. And the truth, no matter how hard it was to face, would be the thing that brought her down. The next morning, I woke up to an unexpected text. It was from Walter. The judge has approved the emergency injunction. Construction is officially halted until the hearing next week. This gives us time, but we need to be ready. Diane is going to come at us with everything she's got. Are you ready? I looked out at the fields where Grandpa had once grown corn and soybeans, now empty and quiet. I could almost hear his voice, reminding me that we had to fight for what was ours. He had spent his entire life protecting this land, and now it was my turn to do the same. I'm ready, I texted back. Let's do this. The next week seemed like an eternity. The court hearing was approaching, and every day felt like a new challenge. Diane Reynolds had already shown her cards, trying to intimidate me with the security detail, accusing me of fraud, and using her influence to force the development forward. But we weren't backing down. We had the truth on our side, and now it was time to show it. The petition to demand an independent audit of the Sunny Pines HOA was gaining momentum. People from all over Meadow Creek, some I hadn't even met before, were stepping up to join our cause. More than 300 signatures were gathered, each one a declaration that Diane's reign was coming to an end. It wasn't just about the land anymore, it was about the entire corrupt system she had built. As we prepared for the hearing, I knew the stakes were high. Diane had powerful allies, and she was pulling every string she could to make sure she didn't lose. I kept reminding myself that it wasn't just about the money or the development, it was about doing what was right, about honoring my grandfather's legacy and protecting a community that had been wronged for far too long. The morning of the court hearing arrived, and I was standing outside the courthouse, my heart pounding in my chest. Walter, my attorney, was beside me, talking with the surveyor we had hired to verify the original property lines. We had all the documents ready, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much bigger fight. We walked into the courthouse, where Diane was already seated with her legal team. She looked confident, almost smug, as if she already knew the outcome. But I wasn't about to let her win, not without a fight. The courtroom was filled with tension as both sides presented their cases. Diane's lawyers were smooth, confident, and well-rehearsed. They made their arguments, claiming that the Sunny Pines development was fully approved, that all the necessary paperwork was in place, and that I was simply trying to stop progress out of spite. But when it was our turn, the truth came out. Walter presented the original surveys from 1910, comparing them to the county's altered records, showing how the property boundaries had been manipulated. We introduced the evidence of financial misconduct from the HOA, Gerald's records, showing how Diane and her family had been siphoning money from the homeowners for years. The surveyor we hired testified about the discrepancies in the property lines, confirming that the land under construction was rightfully mine, as well as the land where the existing homes stood. The room was silent as the evidence piled up. Diane's legal team tried to counter every point, but the facts were on our side. It was clear now, Diane's entire operation had been built on lies and deceit. She wasn't just trying to steal my land, she had been taking from the entire community for years, using her position to control people and force them into selling their homes for far less than they were worth. The judge listened intently, nodding as we presented our case. By the time we finished, it was clear that Diane's strategy of intimidation and manipulation was no longer going to work. The truth had come to light, and there was no denying it. When the judge finally ruled, it was a victory I could hardly believe. The court recognized the original property boundaries, ordering a halt to the Sunny Pines development until the land could be properly surveyed. The fraudulent sale of my land was declared void, and the community was granted the right to hold a full audit of the HOA's finances. Diane Reynolds and her associates were ordered to pay restitution to the homeowners they had wronged. It was a monumental victory, but it wasn't just mine. It was the victory of every homeowner who had been bullied by Diane's HOA. It was the victory of every person who had fought for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against them. As I stood outside the courthouse, looking at the people who had supported me, I felt a sense of pride I had never known before. This was more than just about land. It was about community. It was about standing up to corruption and fighting for what was rightfully ours. Over the following months, things began to change. The Sunny Pines development was redesigned, with a focus on preserving the land's natural beauty and protecting the wetlands that had been threatened. The HOA was restructured, and a new, fairer system was put in place to ensure that no one would ever be forced to sell their property under duress again. Diane Reynolds and her associates faced legal consequences for their actions. The financial misconduct they had engaged in was thoroughly investigated, and many of the homes that had been built on my land were returned to the rightful owners, with compensation for the damages they had suffered. I spent a lot of time at the farmhouse, watching the community come together. The people who had been divided by fear and intimidation were now united by a common cause. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves were now helping each other, sharing resources, and supporting one another. Grandpa Joe's farm was no longer just a piece of land. It had become a symbol of resistance, of the power of the people when they stood together. And though Grandpa was gone, his legacy lived on in the community he had always cared for. I could almost hear him in the breeze, telling me that we had done the right thing. One evening, as I sat on the porch where Grandpa used to tell me stories during summer visits, I looked out over the fields. The eastern section, once threatened by development, was now protected. The wetlands were safe, and the land was being used to benefit the community, just as Grandpa had always intended. Mrs. Thompson joined me on the porch, a glass of lemonade in hand. She smiled as she looked out over the land. "Your grandfather would be so proud," she said softly. "You fought for what was right, and you won." I nodded, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. "It wasn't just me," I replied. "It was all of us. We did this together." In the distance, I saw a blue heron rise from the marsh, soaring above the homes where families now lived in harmony with the land. The storm had passed, and a new chapter had begun for Meadow Creek. The fight for my grandfather's land had been long and hard, but it was worth it. Diane Reynolds and her HOA had underestimated us. They thought they could take what wasn't theirs, but in the end, the truth was the most powerful weapon of all. And the people of Meadow Creek had shown that when you fight for what's right, you can change the world. And so, Grandpa Joe's legacy lived on, not just in the land, but in the community he had always cherished. And I knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning of a new future for Meadow Creek. We had won the fight, and in doing so, we had restored the soul of a community.